Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a recommendation video of science fiction books that read more like fantasy. This could also be described as sci fantasy. These are books in the vein of something like Star Wars. So these are great jumping off points for those of you that typically read fantasy and are looking to get into science fiction. And of course, if you already read science fiction, these are just plain good recommendations. So hopefully you find something to add to your own TBR. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about the Sun Eater series by Christopher Ruocchio, the first book being Empire of Silence. And this is a series that follows the chronicles of a man named Hadrian. And at the beginning of the story, it follows him as he is coming of age, and you get to see him with his family. And of course, the story moves along and he has to go off on a great adventure. The story is being told, as I mentioned, in what's called a chronicle format, so that he is recounting his life and you get to find out how he got to where he ended up, how he got the great titles, and all of the crazy, amazing things that happened over the course of his life. And so this is a book that I want to recommend because I think it will appeal to those of you that really like chronicle stories, which are typically found in fantasy. This book is often described as a read-alike for The Name of the Wind, and I definitely will agree with that. So while this book is set in space, it's set in a future, we are no longer on Earth. At the same time, you very much could forget that it is set in space, and you almost could read this book just thinking that it's set in some secondary world. So the world building was fascinating, and they do make references to some futuristic technology, but for the most part, this is a story of a man. It's a coming of age story and a story of his life, and it hits on all the narrative beats that are commonly found in fantasy. So again, if you like those kind of tales and you just want to have that first person perspective told to you, I think this is a great one to pick up. It's the first book in a long running series, and so you have lots to read, really chunky books, which again are more typically found in fantasy. So if that's something you love, if you love epic fantasy, this is a piece of epic sci fantasy that I think you will really enjoy. Next, I want to talk about the Otherland series by Tad Williams, the first book being City of Golden Shadow. And this is a multi-POV story, which is why I think it will appeal to those of you that love epic fantasy, which typically also has that multiple points of view. The primary one that we follow is a teacher living in South Africa, and she is pulled into this virtual reality by someone that she connects with. And within the story, you find out that this virtual technology is possibly causing people to fall into comas, and so they have to investigate what is going on. As I mentioned, we also have other perspectives, including those that are inside the game itself, and we get to see what life is like inside of this VR. Now, I want to recommend this one for a few reasons. As I mentioned, it's multiple points of view. These books are also very chunky, so you really get that epic feeling when you're reading them, which lends itself more to fantasy. And specifically, the video games that are being played within this virtual reality are typically fantasy games. So in those perspectives where we're in the game, we are basically watching these fantasy stories unfold. And so it feels very fantastical. It just happens to be framed around a scientific idea or scientific technology of the VR. So you have discussions about how virtual technology might apply in this perceived future, but really these books just feel more fantastical. The characters get pulled into the story, and there's twists and turns and tons of political intrigue. So for me, again, technically, yes, it's science fiction, but it appealed to the part of my brain that enjoys fantasy. And so I do think that you should pick up this book if you're looking again for that kind of sci-fantasy feel and blending the two genres together, which of course the author is very well known for his other fantasy books. So this is a great place to try out his science fiction. Next, I want to talk about Repo Virtual by Corey J. White. And this is a novel set in a future where once again we have some aspects of virtual technology, but it is more seen as an overlay to the societies and cities that people live. So within this society, they are able to put on these overlays that cause them to see advertisements and a different version of the city than they're actually living. And so it really hides a lot of the poverty and the realities of the city itself. And so it takes the aesthetics of cyberpunk, but really this is a heist story because at the center of the story, we follow a man who is known as the Repo Man. And in his job, really what he does is takes on heists and steals things and does cons. And within the story, he gets the opportunity to go and do this incredible heist. He ends up stealing something that might involve artificial intelligence, and the story goes from there. I want to recommend this one because again, it's very light on the scientific elements, and it's much more about the heist, which in my opinion is something that more often you see in fantasy stories. You always get a group of ragtag people that come together to steal something. And I feel like that story is told over and over again in fantasy, but I don't see it as much in science fiction. Yes, it does happen, but I thought that this was a great example of a science fiction story that, again, wasn't too heavy on the hard science or the technology, but instead uses that just to tell a really exciting tale. I also think that this one is a little bit more underhyped than some of the other books that are on this list, so hopefully that will appeal to a lot of you as well. Next up, we have Hidden Empire by Kevin J. Anderson, which is the first book in the saga of the Seven Sons, and this is a science fiction story that definitely reads more like fantasy. This is a multi-POV story, and specifically there are tons of multiple perspectives that we follow throughout the course of these 7 books. These books are very long and chunky, so again, lending themselves to the feeling of epic fantasy. The general premise, without going too far into the details, is that it's set in a future where the humanity has broken off into 3 main sects. Some of them have developed telepathic abilities. You have some kind of different religious leanings within these groups, and there is another alien race that we are interacting with, and then there's also another alien race that is believed to have died out. But at the beginning of the story, some archaeologists come across these old remnants of the alien technology, and the repercussions of that cause crazy things to ensue. Now, this is one that I want to recommend to fantasy readers because I think they will get the most out of this series, and that is the fact that it really does read like fantasy in space. Now, this series has a lot of political intrigue woven into the story. It's very character focused, and we follow primarily a lot of characters that are in positions of power. There is a form of monarchy within these growing societies, and so you get to see all the backstabbing, the scheming, those that are trying to gain power, and so forth. And again, it feels more like a fantasy story, which is typically where you see those kind of tropes come in. And so again, it's set in space. It does involve this alien technology, but really that is just a means to get to the end and to get to the place of the story. I will admit the story is very long, in some ways very meandering, and it's perhaps not my favorite on this list, but it definitely gave me those fantasy feels and just that immersive escapist experience that I look for when I typically pick up epic fantasy. And so again, if you're looking for that in science fiction, this might be a really good one to pick up, because again, there's lots of books. I got lost in series and got to binge the books back to back to back, which ended up being a really enjoyable experience for me. Next, I want to talk about Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky, and this is a science fiction novella that is put out by Tor.com. And this is a story that is told over 2 perspectives, one being a young woman who is the leader or one of the leaders of this old medieval-like society on this planet. And then we also follow the perspective of an anthropologist who is there to observe and see the society as they grow and develop. And this is a book that is definitely classified as science fiction because, again, it is set on another planet and it is framed all around this alien race. But when you actually start to read the story, it begins to read a lot more like a fantasy story, because a lot of them, of course, are set in more of a medieval time, which appears to be the period of this race. And so it feels like you're reading fantasy, but you know it's supposed to be science fiction, and you're not quite sure how the perspectives are going to connect together. And the story eventually connects, and when it does, it's absolutely brilliant. I really believe you should go into this book without knowing too much of the plot, but I absolutely love this one because, in my opinion, it takes a fantasy setup and then puts a scientific twist on it. And I just thought that it was really well done, really smart. The narrative is fantastic. And I just think that it really shows the brilliance of Adrian Tchaikovsky's work, and just cannot recommend this one enough. Again, it reads like fantasy, but it's definitely science fiction when it comes down to it. So I'll leave it there and hopefully told you enough to entice you to pick it up for yourself. Next, if I'm going to talk about sci fantasy, I can't make this video without talking about Dune by Frank Herbert. This is the first book in an epic sci fantasy series that follows a man named Paul, who potentially appears to be the chosen one in the society. At the beginning of the story, him and his family are going off to the planet of Dune that has these different cultural aspects to them. There is a substance called spice that is very revered and is treated as a drug, and on this planet water is a worshipped resource because it is so scarce. Within the set of the story, you find out that there are people scheming against his family, there are plot twists, and people are in danger very quickly, and the story goes from there. I think most people know the general plot of the story, especially with the newer movie that came out, but just in case, I will leave it a little bit vague and let you enjoy it for yourself. But this is an epic story. This first book alone is very chunky, and it really plays again with the idea of the chosen one and puts some interesting nuance into the story. For the time it is written, I do think it is very advanced in some of the conversations it's having around character roles, women, and all sorts of conversations surrounding that. And this is definitely a story that, while it is set in space, in my opinion, read a lot more like fantasy. And so when I picked it up, I really had to adjust my expectations because I wouldn't really describe it as space opera. Yes, some of the story does take place in space, but most of the story takes place on the planet of Dune, and it's much more character focused. It's much more focused on the political nuances, the twists, the turns, the backstabbing, and it was just a very absorbing story that is one that I very much understand why people read over and over again, because when I have reread the story, I definitely appreciate it a lot more. So it is worth your time. I do think it's worth trying out for yourself, but you need to go in with the right expectations. And in my opinion, knowing that it is much more like a fantasy narrative really helped me to better appreciate this book for what it was. So again, if you're looking for a fantasy story set in space, set in the future, this is definitely one of the iconic ones that you'll want to try out. Finally, I have to talk about the bind-up of the Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. This is the first bind-up of the first 2 books in the 4-book quartet, and then there's another book that comes afterwards. This is technically science fiction, but I have gotten myself in trouble on the past of my channel because I typically describe it as fantasy. And I understand that it is technically science fiction, but for me, this narrative definitely reads like a fantasy coming-of-age story. The basic premise is that we follow the apprentice to a torturer who at the beginning of the story is in the guild and he is learning the practices. However, as is always the case with these coming of age narratives, there's a reason that he is pushed into the world and has to go on a bit of an adventure. And then we follow him in this world, and this world appears to be what I would describe as a medieval style world. So for me, again, that's why it felt like fantasy. The writing style, the narrative structure, the world building, everything read like fantasy to me. I do understand why this is classified as science fiction, and while I appreciate the technicality, in my mind, you want to pick up this book being ready to experience what will feel like a fantasy narrative. And it's done on purpose, and I do appreciate what the author was doing with these books. But again, you have to be prepared for what you're going to get because it was different than I originally expected based off other things I'd heard from different reviewers as well. So definitely one, again, if you want to pick up some really iconic science fiction fantasy, I really recommend this one because it really blurs the lines more than perhaps any other book on this list, in my opinion at least. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to hear of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd also love for you to tell me what is your favorite science fiction book that you would recommend to someone who normally reads fantasy, or just your favorite sci-fantasy in general. If you're new to my channel, I do read a lot of adult science fiction, fantasy, horror, and thrillers. You can help me out by sharing this video around online, giving me a thumbs up, dropping a comment, even if it's just a little emoji, and if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss another video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.